Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me for Reimagining Education, Conversations on Character, Commitment, and Community. This series is part of the Virtues and Vocations initiative here at Duke University, which seeks to make character, purpose, and meaning central to education and pre-professional and professional education in particular. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Kenan Institute for Ethics here at Duke, the institutional home for the series and the initiative. Before we begin, just a brief note on a couple of logistics. As everything with Zoom, there are often little glitches that emerge. Please do know that there are several folks working behind the scenes who will swiftly jump in and address any problems. Also note that the conversation will last for about 40 minutes, at which time we'll open it up to Q&A. Please submit your questions directly in the Q&A mechanism, and they'll be passed on to me via chat to ask today's conversation partner. Please note that there are often times where we aggregate questions so that we can try to get to everybody's question. There are also times, rarely, when we don't get to everyone's questions. So please understand we're doing our very best to get everybody's voice heard today. With that, I am delighted to introduce Father Greg Boyle on kinship and good work. A native of Los Angeles and a Jesuit priest, Father Greg Boyle holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy and education from Gonzaga. I'm truly sorry about last night's loss. Well fought season nonetheless. He has a master's degree in English from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, a master's degree from the Weston School of Theology in Cambridge, and a Master of Sacred Theology degree from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California. At the conclusion of his theological studies, Father G spent a year living and working in Bolivia, a self-described transformative and radicalizing life experience. Upon his return in 1986, he was appointed as the pastor of Dolores Mission Church, a Jesuit parish in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles that was then the poorest Catholic church in the city. At the time, the Catholic Church sat between two large public housing projects and amidst the territories of numerous gangs. Father G witnessed the devastating impact of gang violence on his community during the so-called decade of death that began in the late 80s and peaked at 1,000 gang-related killings in 1992. In the face of law enforcement tactics and criminal justice policies of suppression and mass incarceration as the means to end gang violence, he and his parish and community members adopted what was a radical approach at the time: treat gang members as human beings. In 1988, they started what would become Homeboy Industries, which employs and trains former gang members in a range of social enterprises, as well as provides critical services to thousands of men and women who walk through the doors each year seeking a better life. Each year, over 10,000 former gang members from across Los Angeles come through Homeboy Industries in an effort to make a positive change. They are welcomed into a community of mutual kinship, love, and offered a wide range of services, including tattoo removal, anger management, parenting classes, etc. Father G is the author of the 2010 bestseller, Tattoos on the Heart: The Power of Boundless Compassion. His newest book, Barking to the Choir: The Power of Radical Kinship, was published in 2017. And his most recent book will be out in October, The Whole Language: The Power of Extravagant Tenderness. He received the California Peace Prize and has been inducted into the California Hall of Fame. In 2014, President Obama named Father G a champion of change. He received the Notre Dame 2017 Laterre Medal, the oldest honor given to American Catholics, and he currently serves as a member of California Governor Gavin Newsom's Economic and Job Recovery Task Force as a response to COVID-19. So clearly a very busy man. We appreciate you taking time with us today. Welcome, Father G.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's good to be with you, and thank you for reopening the wound of last night's loss. Thank you. I'd sort of forgotten it, and then.
Well, I'm hoping this will be a conversation about healing. So what I'm hoping is we can do three things. So really talk about your work and your thinking in Tattoos of the Heart, but also embarking to the choir, and really, to a certain extent, amplifying this notion of kinship, which I think is quite compelling. A second, maybe talk through some of the bigger questions in these two volumes, and how you might be thinking differently, or your thinking has been amplified by this crazy year. And then perhaps take a bit of a step sideways to talk about how your work might be imported into a higher education setting, if you will, and how we might think about cultivating the virtues of kinship, how we think about love in the context of higher education, and that sort of thing. So with that, maybe we can just jump right in. I think that there's a parallelism in each of your books, which have subtitles that include the power of. And so starting with the power of boundless compassion, the power of radical kinship, and the latest, the power of extravagant tenderness. For those less familiar, what do you mean by boundless compassion?
Well, all three, compassion, kinship, and tenderness, it's all kind of a piece, where we're trying to imagine a world that we don't currently know. And so Homeboy always wants to be a solution and a sign. It wants to announce a message, and it wants to be kind of the front porch of the house we all want to live in. So I think that's important, because you're always offering concrete hope and help, but you also want to reimagine things. What if we were to choose love as the architecture of our hearts? What if we, so there's an assertion in compassion, tenderness, and kinship. So you're trying to say, they're kind of baseline principles. Everyone is unshakably good. And sometimes there are things that impede that, and people are strangers to themselves, and they don't have access, for a lot of reasons, to that goodness. They don't become good, they are good, and now life and living is the pursuit of that discovery, that's the truth. The other truth, it comes from Mother Teresa, who says the problem in the world is that we've forgotten that we belong to each other. So everybody's unshakably good. We belong to each other. And now let's imagine a circle of compassion, and let's imagine nobody standing outside that circle. So that's kind of the hope. And even, to kind of have a God overlay here, God's dream come true is compassion and kinship and tenderness, and that you may be one. So how do we create a community of beloved belonging, where we make sure we don't ever sever belonging, and that we remind each other of this exquisite mutuality of connection and tender belonging. And so it's kind of all of a piece. And but I think you can draw some straight lines between kind of what vexes us as a society, as a country, tribalism and division, and the things that have kind of traditionally kept us from achieving God's dream come true, which is kinship.
So I love how you framed this as sort of the front porch of the house we'd all like to live in. And this is, these volumes are each in some ways an effort to reimagine and to live up to God's dream for us of this exquisite connection. what do you see in starting really with your own work over the past 40 years as barriers to that? And how do we as individuals aspire to overcome that and work toward overcoming that?
Yeah, I think one of the principal things that kind of has been dawning on me lately is how badly we name things. It's a little bit like Jesus, and God love him, but he sees the guy having seizures, and he and everybody in the crowd thinks he's possessed by a demon, and he heals them, and we all look at the miracle. But the truth is he has epilepsy, that in fact Jesus and the crowd named this incorrectly. And so how do we name things better? It matters how we name things, because if we name things incorrectly, then we're off to the races. And so what oddly, we strike a high moral distance between us and them. And the truth of the matter is, moralism has never kept us moral. It's always kept us from each other. So oddly, the very thing that we kind of aspire to is some kind of moral sense. My gosh, who knew that this actually kept us from kinship? And so if you're, I think, anchored in principles that everybody's unshakably good and we belong to each other, then you're more careful in naming things. You don't want to name things that create distance, that sever belonging. And there I just found, kind of in the last number of years, not just this horrible last year, but now things are kind of writ large. You kind of go, oh, this is the problem. We've named things incorrectly, and then we're at a dead end. And then it's tribal, and then it's us versus them. But how do you obliterate the illusion that we are separate and insist that there is no them? Here at Homeboy, I mean, that's kind of walking with gang members for 37 years has helped, get to a place where, you see enemies, rivals, people who used to shoot at each other, and how they, now they're brothers and sisters and they're connected. And now, does that always happen? Yes, it always happens. Any exceptions? No. So this kind of teaches us something that radical about this is the longing of the human heart, is to be joined with each other. And yet we sabotage ourselves constantly in the pursuit of that.
So how do you think, right? So taking those two assumptions that we are all unshakably good and that we belong to each other, is there a moment at which you took those for granted and moved from there, or was this a set of conclusions you came to through faith or through experience? And how might we all come to those points of departure? Because I do think those are significant stumbling blocks to moving forward. I don't know that those are universally held assumptions. And do we take them on faith? Do we need to experience that? What would you say?
Yeah, you broke up a little bit in there, Suzanne.
So,
but I think I got the gist of it. I think yeah, I know. I if you don't assume, if you think there's such a thing as good guys and bad guys, then all bets are off. We're going to continue down this path. And the writer George Saunders says, kindness is the only non-delusional response to everything. And he's quite right. But also, the implication, of course, is that everything else is delusional. Our anger, our self-righteousness, our divisions, our tribalism, it's all delusional. Kindness is the only non-delusional response. And again, I think he's wonderfully correct in this, you know. So, you know, we're at this moment where you know, like for example, you know, campaigns against hate. Well, I don't know, who do you think you're talking about? You know, robots who hate? Or do you think it's an idea that's sort of in the ether? You cannot have that notion of hate without human beings who belong to us. Now what? So you have, I mean, I can't very well stand with the demonized, the gang member, until the demonizing stops, and then turn around and demonize. And people want you to trade in your demonizing for their demonizing. And it's an illusion, it's delusional. And so I'm, you know, I can't do it. And you can't stand with the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away and then turn around and throw people away. So so I'll, you know, so you know, the Tree of Life Synagogue, a terrible tragedy of a number of years ago, and killed people in as they were worshiping. And again, I make a distinction between evil and horrible. That was terrible. But the minute you say evil, then you have to sever belonging. I don't know how else to do this. And then it's us versus them. And then it's a campaign against hate. And frankly, my alma mater, who lost last night, you know, as soon, right, and good-hearted, right after that tragedy, they started a seminar called Hate. But if they had started a seminar called Health, we'd probably make better progress, because nobody healthy, whole, integrated, balanced, stable goes into a synagogue and opens up fire. Now you can name it as anti-Semitic, but nobody healthy, whole, balanced, well does that. And so if it's about health, you don't sever belonging, and we will make progress. But if it's about hate, then it's just self-congratulatory. We don't hate, and we hate the people who hate. And this is why we don't make progress ever. And so I think it's a complicated thing. And yet I think that's more reverent of complexity, but you have to believe that everybody is unshakably good and we belong to each other. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And none of us are well until all of us are well. So, you know, I heard a guy on CNN talking about the guy who drove the car into and tragically killed the Capitol police officer. And he's a smart guy. He's a very smart guy. And he says, obviously, this guy had some grievance and was trying to impact and change policy. And I go, oh, no. So the presumption is, let's begin from a rational, healthy place. No healthy human, whole, well, integrated, balanced person tries to address a grievance by driving a car into a police officer. Sorry. Now, that just means we've labeled it incorrectly, and you go down a rabbit hole once you do that, because it's a way of saying the guy driving the car doesn't belong to us. And do I think that's the root of all that is wrong in this country? Yeah, that's exactly at the root. But sometimes even with virtues and values, you know, it's kind of, I want to become that virtuous value, person with values. And yet it's really kind of a measure of health. It wasn't like Donald Trump's a bad guy. He's not well. And it isn't like Joe Biden is a good and decent man. He's healthy. And it's in the same way you see somebody who's morbidly obese and who's a chain smoker. I'm no doctor, but I think that's probably not healthy. In the same way you see somebody beat down an elderly Asian woman on the streets of San Francisco, and you go, this person's not well. This person belongs to us. And if I demonize that person, that's the opposite of how God sees this scene. And am I convinced of that? Nothing would change my mind on that. Nothing ever. And so, but it's hard for us because we like drawing the lines, and I think we're invited to erase them.
So clearly this is right, for you, this is foundational, and shapes everything you do. How do you bring others into this perspective? And so, especially working with gang members who have emerged through other commitments and other relationships that in all likelihood don't match up to this. How do you come alongside and bring them along or engage them in this perspective?
Yeah, well, I think, so Homeboy's been around for 33 years. So the first 10 years solidly were about, death threats, bomb threats, and hate mail, not from gang members, but from people who demonize gang members. And it was untenable for me not to, according to them. And so it was startling. So the point of giving talks about Homeboy was to put a human face on the gang member, so the demonizing would stop. And obviously we made progress on that, because in the last 20 years we really haven't had anything like that ever. So it's because we've made progress in the good here. So so you want to be able to kind of announce something different, and then people see it, and if folks get proximate, if they go to the vicinity of folks on the margins and stand there, then their hearts are altered, and then suddenly you have more room in your heart for other people. And I've learned this from gang members, and like the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and it's a scale of 1 to 10, and a father was in prison or mentally ill, or mother was a drug addict, or sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect. It's 10 things that happen to you under 18 years of age. And so experts say if you're a 4 or a 5 on the ACEs study, you're going to have health issues and you're going to have socializing issues. I'm a 0 on the ACEs study. And that's more a testament to my privilege than anything else. But every man and woman who walks through our door at Homeboy is a 9 or a 10 on the ACEs, which is extraordinary. And so how do we stand in awe at what the poor have to carry rather than in judgment at how they carry it? So that's kind of a key thing, and just a real quick aside, I gave a training once at Quantico for the FBI on gangs, and it was 3 days, and long story, but at one point they were giving us a tour, and you go to the end of a hallway, and there are the 10 most wanted of the FBI, and number 1 at the time was Osama bin Laden. Number 2 was a kid I knew since he was 10, and I knew I didn't win any points in my little tour group to say, oh, I know that guy. He grew up in the projects. But what I know about him is huge mental illness, huge trauma, the most damaged human being among them I've ever known. Traumatized people are going to cause trauma. Damaged people are going to cause damage. And it is our contention here at Homeboy that cherished people will find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. But there's no way I would ever look at number 2 on the FBI most wanted list and say, that guy's evil, just because it's not very sophisticated. I think we're not even trying when we do that. And so there's a naming that couldn't be less reverent for how complex the human person is. I've never met an evil person. I once said that at a talk, I said, "You've never met an evil person." It was a packed room, and the guy in the front row said, "I have," and I don't argue with them, but I just remember thinking, no, you think you have. You just don't know the whole story. You just don't know it, and you've allowed yourself to go to that place which is unsophisticated and simple. And we ought not to.
So let's press on that idea a little bit. So we ought not to. You would argue he has, in fact, never met an evil person. How does he come to understand that fact? And at different points, you talk about working with the marginalized is not about them. It's about how it changes you. Is that a route for someone like him? Or, right, I don't know how we argue with that perspective.
Well, we're starting to do something like that here in LA, for example, so there's a whole movement, the alternatives to incarceration and how do we address mass incarceration. And there's a kind of a mantra that we have, and not we, but the county, care first, jail second. And so the notion is to reimagine how we do this. So what we've historically done is we have decided to punish wound. And you don't punish wounds, you heal them, you tend to them, you care for them. And that's hard to do if you think there's such a thing as good people and bad people.
So let's sort of fast forward a little bit and talk about this past year. And you've alluded to this in your references to tribalism and things, but you have this great quote in Tattoos of the Heart that says, "Healing is messy and human and gut-wrenching and hilarious, and it is not a precise science." Can you reflect on that particular quote in the context of this past year and the extent to which this past year has amplified, reinforced, or changed your thinking at all?
Well, I think the past year has had a lot to do with grieving. On the one hand, the unsettling part of it was, it threw a monkey wrench into everybody's identity and everybody's existence, and that's always kind of interesting. So you have to lean into grief and you have to be curious about it, and eventually you can even savor it and even relish it. And then on the other side of that is joy. So the invitation is always to joy, no matter what happens. So, oddly, I've buried 14 gang members, men and women who, mainly all men except for one woman, who were killed during this time of pandemic. And, the city wants to know, why is there this huge increase? And it's because, gang violence is about a lethal absence of hope. And nothing messes with people's hope than a once in 100-year event like the pandemic. So that kind of accounts for it, And so I've been having 4 or 5 funerals. Half of them are COVID and half of them are gang violence. And so it's really kind of startling. And so you have to kind of reconfigure. And it's funny, when you quoted me and had the word hilarious in there, I think that's sort of key, because the Dalai Lama once talked about laughter, and he says, when people laugh, they change their minds. And so, but we're so convinced in our tribalism, how do we win the argument? How do we convince people? And there's something about laughter, if that becomes your North Star. Here a homegirl was leading a tour one day, and I was ear hustling. I could hear her, and she said, here at Homeboy, we laugh from the stomach. And everybody here knows exactly what she means, that it's not it is the deepest, most profound healing whole thing that they get it. You know, I had a homie in my office just a couple days ago, and he was works in the bakery, and he was on his break, and he had a hairnet and a mask and his apron covered in flour. And I had helped him during the pandemic to fix his teeth, which had been alarming. And so he said, "Can I take my mask off and show you my grill?" And I said, "Sure." And he does, a big Colgate smile, and it's aligned and white. And then he says to me, "Not only did you pay for this smile, you're the reason I'm smiling." And before I can say anything, he goes, "Hey, that's good. Write it down," you know? And so then he dictated it to me. "Not only did you pay for this smile," and I think he just was hoping to be in my next book, which mission accomplished. I wrote about it this morning, but we just howled with laughter. And, you know, this is a guy who's had a really hard life, but there's something that coaxes the heart to soften, and it happens in a culture where people feel cherished. So then it's never about surviving as the fittest. It's about thriving as the nurtured, and everybody wants to participate in that, you know, and that's the hope.
Great. The questions in your absence were queuing up furiously, so I'm going to turn to them now, if you don't.
Okay, go.
Great. So the first one is, in light of the systemic racism that has so clearly come into focus during the last year, how can we stand in the circle of kinship without white normative culture causing further harm to communities of color?
Yeah, you know, and the murder of George Floyd has awakened language, and that is a decidedly good thing. And then the curtain has been pulled back, and racism hides in systems, and it's still about people. And so our tendency is to be self-congratulatory rather than make progress. And it is, in fact, why we don't make progress. So, you know, I will just posit a sort of an odd thing. Matthew Dowd, who's a political pundit, he asked the question, I thought it was really quite good. He says, why did it take 100 years from Reconstruction to Emmett Till and voting rights and civil rights? Why did it take 100 years? And he said, because a third of the country didn't believe that all men and women are created equal. And I think he's right. But then he says, and it took 57 years or so from Martin Luther King, whose anniversary of his death we celebrated on Easter Sunday. It took 57 years from Martin Luther King to January 6th, Proud Boys, Charlottesville, you know, Donald Trump. And then he says, it's because a third of the country don't believe that all men and women are created equal. Now, I think he's correct. Now what? Who are those people? And you can say, well, they're bad and they're evil and they're monster, and we're off to the races and we won't make progress. And that's why nothing changes. But if you say nobody healthy, whole, integrated, well, shares that view, and now we can do something. Then we can tend to people. And just as I don't want, you know, jails to continue to punish wound, I think the third of the country who don't believe that all men and women are created equal, they belong to us and they're not well. A third of all the military refused to get vaccines. I don't think that's a political position. I think they're not well. Homies refuse to get the vaccine, not because they're stupid or uninformed. It's because they're traumatized and they're not whole and they're not completely other than strangers to themselves yet. That's okay. That's what we're here for. That's what we're on this planet for. is to tend to each other, to care for each other, so that people can inhabit the truth of who they are, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. I think if you're an anti-vaxxer, you're not well. That's okay. Lots of people aren't well. I mean, I have cancer, I have leukemia, and I'm doing okay right now. But you don't hate cancer. I saw a t-shirt the other day that said "fuck cancer," and I go, I don't even get what that means. You tend to people who have it. You care for people who have it. You try to heal cancer. You don't try to, I don't know, separate it from our reality. It's just so. And I think this year, and particularly the Black Lives Matter movement, awakened a language where I went, oh, okay. But it shouldn't awaken an us and them ever. Even as we're trying to address systemic racism that hides in systems. But the problem is that we've forgotten that we belong to each other. And the only thing that we should exclude is excluding. And I think inclusion is God. So I can't think other than that.
Great, thank you. Next question. Father G, thanks so much for all you do. My church group, book group, is reading Tattoos right now. Christianity, as I understand it, says men are bad and fallen and need God, and maybe in the form of the mercy you and others show. Any insight there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone off the rails in many ways, and this is probably heretical, but it's like, yikes. Christianity is something you do. It's not adherence to a list of beliefs that hang out in your head. It was always something at the beginning. It was something that people did. It was, a way of life. And Christians would greet each other with the holy kiss. They would kiss each other smack dab on their lips. And the reason you did that, because you only did that with your blood relatives. So this was a way of saying, hey, this is inclusive. This is everybody belongs. Nobody is to be left out. Get over here. I'm going to kiss you on the lips, and we've lost that sense of connection and how we are inextricably bound to each other. And sin, and the notion of sin, is self-estranging. It severed our belonging. And find me a mystic who believes in hell, and I will think you've located somebody who's not a mystic. All these mystics, kind of get to the dawn of the cross, and they just say, yeah, I don't know, sin doesn't make any sense. Once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods. and that's what we're supposed to do. That's what mature spirituality is about. And the highest form of spiritual maturity is tenderness. So we want to get to that place where we receive the tender glance of God, and then we become the tender glance of God in the world. What could be better? Because that's where the joy is. My joy, yours, your joy complete is the promise.
Great. The next question. We are all broken and wounded in our own ways. How can we engage in the work, even as we are working toward our own wholeness?
Yeah, I think I always talk about, the task here. We always look at each other, the homies and ourselves, and we say, you have to do the work. And part of the work is to make friends with your own wound, because if you don't, you will be tempted to despise the wounded. And you see it around here all the time. It's a measure of how people have done the work or not done the work. So if they're quick, to off with their heads and let's banish them forever and one false move, well, that just means you haven't befriended your own wound. And there's a consequence to that. And I think it's Thich Nhat Hanh who says, keep your loneliness warm, which means, keep your wound close at hand because you're going to need it. You're going to need it to be compassionate and to receive people, to make room in your heart for people. And it comes up all the time when you hear people say, what his problem is, he thinks his shit don't stink. It's people who I don't want to be taken advantage of or whatever. But it's always a sign of somebody being a stranger to themselves. And so you always want to challenge it, as we do here. And I could line up 8 homies and I could ask them, are you going to get the vaccine? And 6 of them will say no, and crazy things like Bill Gates put a microchip in it or something like that. And then you'll have 2 guys say, oh, of course I'm going to get the vaccine. Well, if you were people who work here would say, find me the 2 healthiest, most whole, complete, dealing with their stuff, have done the inner work, which are the most, and they would pick the 2 who said, sure, I'm going to get the vaccine. So it's a measure of how healthy people are, how whole, integrated, well, balanced, stable. And people, you have to wait for people, they'll get there. So the more they deal with their trauma, the more trusting they are. So this is a trust issue. This isn't about so much about disinformation, though, those kinds of things in this age, QAnon only works with people who are damaged, who aren't whole, who are susceptible and receptive to craziness because they're not well.
Okay, next one. How do you advocate for a health-centered model on a policy level? What resources exist for cities, states, et cetera, to invest outside of punitive action?
Yeah, I think it's, this is for people who are, dedicated to the long haul, because if you want some short relief on this, you're going to be frustrated. So you want to be able to be patient, so I've been at this for 37 years and things have changed. And Barack Obama used to say, if you don't think things have changed, you have not been paying attention. Now, you might not be satisfied, obviously, and nobody should be, about how things have changed. And yet it's so incremental, and it's, one step at a time, and you wait for people. Ours is a God who waits. Who are we not to wait? And you have to wait for people to somehow inhabit, this truth, where I find my true self in loving. And that's hard to do. But we're all walking each other home, as Ram Dass used to say. And so how do we walk everybody home? You don't just say, I'm going to walk my tribe home. I'm going to walk my family home. No, that's the whole point of kinship, is to, leave nobody behind. Everybody belongs. Even you want to fire all the other gods. You want to fire the God who hates the same people you do, and how do you get there? So you want to rethink, how do you choose love as the architecture of your heart?
So in these conversations, there are often students in the audience who I can imagine hearing the line, wait for people to inhabit this truth, as, right, sort of
passive.
Well, not as passive, but how long do I wait? Is there anything I can do to hurry it up? Are there ways, how do they as individuals, or we as a community, do this better, or practice it, or engage with these issues?
Yeah, there's a line in the Tom Hanks movie about Mr. Rogers where Mrs. Rogers talks to the journalist, and he asks her, how's it feel to be married to a saint? And he says, oh, I don't really like that word because it suggests that people don't have access to this. And then she said, he's not a perfect person. I mean, he gets angry, but he's learned how to catch himself. And then she looks at him and she says, it's a practice. He works at it. And all the while that she's saying this, Mr. Rogers is on a rope line, fully attentive to the person right in front of him, delighting in the person in front of him. And I remember when I saw that, I kind of went, yeah, that's the whole deal. It's a practice. You have to work at it. So you don't decide once and for all to cherish people. You don't even pray in the morning and meditate and say, okay, now I'm good to cherish people. No, you have to choose to cherish with every breath you take. Otherwise, it won't work. It's a practice. You have to work at it. And so, and I don't want to suggest that I'm good at this. I have the intentionality to do it. I have the desire and the longing to do it, and the desire for the desire to do it. So I'm every moment you're always practicing with right now I look out into our reception area and part of me doesn't want to get off this Zoom with you because I know what it's going to be. It's going to be belligerent and hard-headed and annoying, and you want to delight in the people who are exactly right in front of you, and you don't want to look over their shoulder to kind of see who else is next. No, you want to be perfectly attentive, and it's hard. But I know that that's where the joy is, in inhabiting your true self and loving. And you don't care about return, you don't care about outcome, you don't care about success. You just love being loving. And I know that works, but that's the thing you have to practice every single day of your life and meant in every breath.
So I like this notion of, right, choosing to cherish and then practicing. And would you say that over these 37 years, you have gotten better at it? Is it
I think everybody gets better at everything, and but you want to be wide-eyed and you just want to pay attention, but you have to kind of jettison things, like I don't try to save, rescue, or fix anybody ever. And when we want to fix somebody, it's because we think that God wants us to be fixed. It's crazy making. But you have to jettison that notion, that you don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the folks there make you different. And then that feels passive, but it really is about allowing yourself to be reached by the other. And that's what it's all about. And in the process, you're all assuming and inhabiting your own mutual dignity and nobility. And that's where the power happens. It's not me empowering them. It's us together inhabiting this together.
So we always like to end on a question around what you are most hopeful about at the current moment. So we're just a minute out, and if you could just say something in particular that you are hopeful about at this juncture.
Well, I kind of find myself lately saying I'm both optimistic and hopeful, and I'm rarely both of those at the same time. I feel like the Black Lives Matter movement has jostled something very significant in the country, and again, I think it's awakened a language that's given people a facility to kind of be generous and magnanimous, and to the idea is, how do we widen the container that we previously had sort of locked ourselves in. And the more we do that, we become spacious and expansive as the God who loves us without measure and without regret. So, I'm hopeful kind of for a new, it's 2020 vision. We all hated 2020, but it kind of gave us a clarity of vision, like 2020 vision. And I really think it did that. And we'll never forget that year. And maybe we will be more determined than ever to be tender with each other.
So I love our ability to leave on both a hopeful and an optimistic note in this conversation. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us today, especially given technical difficulties and the crowd of people queuing up outside your office as we've spoken. So I really appreciate you taking time for us today. So
great being with you. Give my love to everybody there at the Institute too.
Wonderful. And next week, please join us for James Arthur on how the Jubilee Center contextualizes virtues. Thank you very much.